speaks another. Tonight we have a very special guest, and that guest is Dr. Eqbal Ahmed. And for about a year or two now, we've been trying to entice Eqbal to Ottawa. And Eqbal has a very interesting and varied background, and I'm going to try and briefly describe some of it. He's a professor of international relations and Middle Eastern studies at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, and a writing fellow of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Program on Peace and International Security. He's a specialist on international relations and third world affairs. He's a managing editor of the Third World Quarterly Racing Class, contributing editor of the Middle East Report, member of the editorial board of Arab Studies Quarterly, and a columnist for third world newspapers including The Dawn in Pakistan, The Pioneer in India, The Star in Bangladesh, and Al Hayat in the Arab world. He's also written in the United States in a variety of scholarly journals and newspapers, and these have included the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's Monthly Review, Mother Jones, New Yorker, and the New York Times, of which he was a guest columnist during 1979. He holds a PhD in political science and Islamic studies from Princeton University, where he was awarded the university's highest academic award for graduate students. He writes and lectures on the Third World, comparative revolutions, and foreign policies of the great powers. He was also a leading opponent of U.S. intervention in Indochina. He was unsuccessfully charged by the U.S. government with conspiring along with Father Berrigan to kidnap Henry Kissinger. Dr. Eqbal Ahmed now divides his time between the United States and Pakistan, where he's engaged in establishing Khaldunia University, a private institution. What this biographical sketch does not do is convey the deep respect and esteem that his colleagues and peers have for Eqbal Ahmed. Noam Chomsky, in his earliest essays in the 60s and the 70s, referenced the thoughts of Eqbal Ahmed. I think of For Reason of State, and if you want to go and look the reference up, it's page 85. More recently, Edward Said dedicated his magnum opus, Culture and Imperialism, to Eqbal Ahmed. And a few days ago, I have this bad habit of calling up people, and I spoke with Christopher Hitchens to thank him for his skewering of Conor Cruz O'Brien, and I mentioned that Eqbal Ahmed would be coming to Ottawa, and he said, "Please give Eqbal my love." And that's sort of a little bit of the tip of the deep affection and esteem that people have for Eqbal Ahmed. Please join me in welcoming Eqbal Ahmed to Ottawa.
Thanks a lot. If most Arabs or Pakistanis or Indians or Indonesians or anyone remotely resembled Imran Qureshi, we will not remain an underdeveloped countries. He has remarkable energy. I had never met this young man until this afternoon, but his voice has become very familiar to me on the phone. And on the issue of Islam and its detractors, he is literally a mobile encyclopedia. And I'm counting this weekend to get as much help from him as it is possible to get. Imran has asked me to speak on prospects of democracy in the Muslim world. Is that correct? If I had messed up the topic, I would not sure. What I would like to do is to first clear some of the misconceptions and conceptions about democracy itself. Yeah, that's an intelligent thing to do. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Then I would talk about its prospects or lack thereof in Muslim countries. First, democracy itself. It's irrespective of what you hear about Greek democracy and the Magna Carta and so on, the absolute plain truth is that that democracy as a system of government, as a set of values, as full-blown constitutional systems, is a relatively modern, recent form. Its development is associated with the social changes and ideas spawned by capitalism and industrialism in the modern age, which means the last 250, 300 years. Spawned by the decline of feudal elites, feudal controls of economy, by the rise of urban bourgeoisie, by the rise of an urban middle class, and spawned finally by the rise of a growing industrial working class and intelligentsia, mostly based in cities. Once these social changes occurred, and they did happen to occur in the Western world first, there was a long period of struggle before democratic forms took roots or gained legitimacy. It is then Western democracy only in the sense that since modern capitalism, modern imperialism, and modern industrialism developed in the West, and democracy is associated with these new economic forms, it's only in that sense that democracy can be given a regional or civilizational label. Now, in that sense, since social change of this kind, and the world has never known perhaps since the discovery of fire, the kind of changes that industrialism and capitalism brought about, in that sense, all the major modern ideologies are Western, in the sense that they first had their incubation and growth in the industrialized capitalist Western world. This would be true of nationalism, this is true particularly of fascism, and this is true also of communism and socialism. All these ideologies had their births at the center, at the heart of the first industrial civilization. So they are civilization, their civilizational association is connected to a particular history, the history of the growth of industrialism and capitalism. A third point I want to quickly make is that in the Western world, the actual development of democratic systems, democratic governments, is very closely linked to the history of imperialism. Yeah? Very, very organically, almost symbiotically linked to the history of imperialism. Because what happens when industrialism and capitalism begin to grow? You all know that I'm speaking in shorthand. What happens is that old lives are destroyed, old traditions are destroyed, old classes are destroyed, new classes, new traditions, new social forces emerge. When those new social forces emerge, they make massive demands for accommodation. When those massive demands for accommodation are made, a system is most of the time not able to absorb those demands. To absorb those demands, you need to have safety valves, places to which you can transfer the tensions of these rapid social changes. If you don't have the safety valve, you could get into trouble. Now, note something. The imperial expansion is starting with the imperial expansion begins from the origins of capitalism itself. Capitalism was still in its mercantilist stage that the big discoveries of America took place. That large migrations had slowly begun. By the time capitalism had entered fully into the industrial age, imperial expansion was blowing all over the world. Millions of people moved from England, from France, from Denmark, from Sweden, from all these places. They moved to other places. They found themselves adventures to engage in. They found themselves conquests to be made. And all this served as a safety valve. The result was that democratic forms have developed in the Western world precisely in those industrializing societies which were able to expand at the expense of somebody else. Those who couldn't expand produced fascism. It was that simple. I'm making it a crude analogy to you. Just watch Germany. Europe had 4 major civilizational systems: the Hispanic, the French, the Italian, the Germanic, and the English. The English had massive empires, followed closely by the French, followed closely by the Belgians, the Dutch. All of them developed democratic systems of government. A major civilizational force in Europe, Germany, was a colonial have-not. It just couldn't get past British and French blockages to expand its colonial power. And the tensions of not having those safety valves produced in Germany, this is something that the scholars of fascism, it's an issue that the scholars of fascism have been avoiding, by and large, except for 1 or 2. Remember Hitler's major grouse against the British and the French. Lebensraum. You all have living spaces. You all have colonies. You all have empires. We, the Germans, have been denied that living space, Lebensraum. We are gonna take it from you. We are colonial have-nots. Same was true of Italy. Beyond these little Libya and the invasion of Ethiopia, they had no big empires. And Spain was a receding colonial power precisely at the moment of its industrial growth. The result, Spain turned fascist, Portugal, receding empire, turned fascist, Germany turned fascist, Italy turned fascist. So, main point I'm making to you is that when you have rapid social change taking place and safety valves are missing, safety valves can be of 2 kinds. See, imperial powers were not only drawing raw materials from their colonies, cheap raw materials from their colonies, and bringing it home to be converted into capitalist goods. They were also using the colonies as markets where they could dump their products. And they were also using the market as the colonies as a safety valve to transfer to it tensions of social change. Study the careers of Warren Hastings. Study the careers of Robert Clive. Study the careers of Dalhousie's. You are thinking of men who were, if they had stayed in England, they would have been on the barricade. profile of Robert Clive, by the way, is very similar to that of Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, or the French revolutionaries. But he had another thing to do. He conquered India for them. It was a nice activity. So it's important for us to keep in mind that any people, Western, Eastern, black, yellow, or white, who are going to go through massive social change and do not have safety valves, do not have economic well-being, do not have roads to prosperity open, will find it very hard to develop democratic systems of government. In the Western world, in the discourse here, you almost see, you are shown this in cultural terms. It's the best West versus the rest. We are democratic, the rest don't have the democratic tradition. Those are nonsensical, ignorant statements. We shouldn't take them too seriously. Move on to the next one. The third world's experience with democracy contrasts very sharply with that of any other people, Western people, for example. Our experience is democracy, including Muslim experience with democratic governance, is a very bitter experience. Our first encounter with democracy was as oppressive. Democracies came to us as oppressors, as colonizers, as violators. As violators. They spoke the language of enlightenment and engaged in the activities of barbarians. This was our primary experience with democratic societies at first. And second, after decolonization, our experience with, again, the democratic power centers, the United States, France, Britain, our experience, even in our second stage of our post-colonial history, our experience was one of these big Western powers calling themselves the free world and actually actively promoting neo-fascism and neo-fascist governments in one Muslim country and one third world country after another. Historically, the United States has spoken of democracy and has supported samosas, Trujillos, the dictators of Zaire like Mobutu Seko, Suharto of Indonesia, Shah of Iran, Zia-ul Haq of Pakistan, name them. Dictators have been their best friends. Therefore, what the Western world found for 50 years after decolonization, that the profitable thing to do was to support dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, even tyrannies in the third world countries. I cannot think of an exception to this rule. Between 1945 and 1979, 1980, 1985, I can't think of an exception. Therefore, our first experience with democracy was one of outright oppression. Our second experience with democracy was one of promoted fascisms, proto-fascisms in some cases. So, what are we going to do with an inheritance so mixed? How is the Muslim world dealing with the question of democracy versus other forms of government. Before I answer this question, allow me very briefly again to give you a picture that I have of the Muslim world today. We have to keep that picture in mind before we can assess the future of democracy. Our civilization has moved honestly, steadily, without let-up over the last 300 years, from a steady decline to free fall. That's our record until now. The fall at the moment is so great that I cannot think of another time that this civilization and this people, these governments, have been in a worse shape. When I grew up as a child, I used to be told stories of the climax of decline of Muslims. The moment cited was the fall of Baghdad. And the story cited was that when Baghdad fell, the ulama of Baghdad were discussing for the third day, on the day that Baghdad fell to the Mongols, this was their third day of heated discussion about whether the owl was halal or haram. Right? But think of our time. Think of our time. We live in a time I have seen in the last 20 years. Things that if in a previous life I had been told I will see, I would have had a nervous breakdown. I'm seriously saying this to you. But somehow managed to see it, and we are surviving. I have seen a country, Muslim country called Palestine, colonized exactly in the year or 1 year after the age of decolonization had begun. The era of decolonization begins formally in 1947 with the independence of India and Pakistan from British rule. And in 1948, Palestine was colonized by a settler people, and its people were driven out of their ancient homeland. And at that time, the Arab world was independent, most of it. Not all of it, most of it was. And that independent Arab countries couldn't save it from a dramatic and total colonization of Palestine. We had a taste then. We had a warning at that time of what post-colonialism is about, what independence is about. With that warning, what did we do? I will jump stages, I will jump incidents. One that stands out in my mind is the first in world history